Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
So welcome to this CIHT podcast. I'm your host, Justin Ward. We live almost in extraordinary times, and we had originally planned to record this interview face to face, but things have changed. Things have changed rapidly across the world. So I'm actually joined by Juliet Mian, an infrastructure resilience expert with many years of experience on a wide range of infrastructure projects across many sectors. She is Technical Director of Resilience Shift, Associate Director at Arup, and also the UK representative to PIARC. So we're looking at global resilience today, but can we start with just exploring the Resilience Shift program and how you got involved in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And hi, Justin. And just reflecting, as many people around the world at the moment are, we're finding new ways of working and adapting as we go. So we hope that this recording is a success. So yeah, one of my key focuses and areas of work at the moment is the Resilience Shift, for which I'm the technical director. In short, the Resilience Shift is a global initiative with the aim to upscale resilience thinking, resilience practice across critical infrastructure sectors. We're really looking at continuity of critical infrastructure with a focus on the services that communities rely on. When we talk about critical infrastructure, we sort of bring that down to the four key sectors, which are transport, water, energy, and digital communications. And I think right now, we're seeing more than ever how society fundamentally relies on the continuity and the ability of those services to continue to function. So we work across those four sectors, focusing on what we can do within each sector and how we can upscale resilience practice, but also more importantly, and I think a really interesting aspect of what we do is the transferring learning between sectors to achieve a true sort of holistic system-wide resilience approach. Resilience Shift was founded back in 2017, so we're sort of just starting into year 4. It's supported by the Lloyd's Register Foundation, which is the charitable organisation that sits above the Lloyd's Register Group, and it's hosted by Arup. So the other part of my job, I'm an associate director in Arup. But what's unique about the Resilience Shift is it draws very strongly on those two sort of big global organisations and the depth of expertise that they have. But it sits outside certainly any of the sort of commercial work that either of the organisations do, and is very much focused on, it's a not-for-profit initiative. We're sharing knowledge. We work in 3 ways of sort of convening events and hosting events and discussions and workshops, awarding grants. So this is not work that is done by Arup. We act as the host institution, the grant management and the sort of thought leadership part of the Resilience Shift, but we work very much with a whole range of grantees with their networks and their expertise around the world.
Useful, I guess, just to define what we mean by resilience and resilient infrastructure.
Absolutely. It's always our favourite thing to spend a bit of time on the definitions of resilience. I find it's something that we could spend many, many days on. Just to try and keep it simple, we want our infrastructure systems to be able to withstand, adapt or recover quickly from expected and unexpected events. I think there's some key sort of issues in there, which is around there are shocks or threats or risks that we know about, and we need to manage, mitigate and respond to those risks. There are also things which are unknown and unexpected. And as you mentioned in the introduction, right now we're seeing how a global pandemic plays out across the world. And that's very much in the space of, that's not a risk that anyone could have single-handedly predicted, managed, responded to. So now it's much more about the response, recovery, how the whole system continues to function. Thinking about that in the context of infrastructure, there are all sorts of drivers or threats that our infrastructure systems are facing. I think a very sort of real evident one in the UK is a combination of our aging infrastructure assets and the new environment of climate change within which they have to function. But there's also the introduction of new technologies into our infrastructure systems that's creating new connectedness between the systems that we weren't necessarily doing 15, 20 years ago, changing customer expectations. So again, right now we really are relying on our infrastructure to be as reliable as it possibly can be. And we're seeing very much that failure in any way of any of our infrastructure systems when the world is as stressed as it currently is would be a huge problem. So really the what we're looking for is this shift in thinking from managing risks that we know about towards being resilient to things that we know and things that we don't know. Very much systems thinking, so not considering individual assets, but considering the role of those assets in a much wider system, and finding ways to work with and adapt to the uncertain future in which our infrastructure needs to function.
And obviously at the moment we can see the balance between, you mentioned the four sectors, transport, water, energy and digital, and particularly the balance of transport and digital is quite key at the moment when we're faced with a global pandemic. People are connecting virtually as opposed to in person. But you've done work in water, which is interesting, and perhaps it'd be good to hear about the lessons from that work for the other sectors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So a significant body of work that we did as Resilient Shift over the past couple of years has been in the water sector. We have worked in other sectors as well, but there has certainly been a big demand and sort of drive from the water sector to start dealing with resilience. And we've done a number of things in there because the work we do, we're aiming high as Resilient Shift. So we're working across the sectors. We're also recognizing that to introduce this shift, we need to look at policy and what's needed to sort of influence and change policy. We need to shape practice and provide practitioners with knowledge, tools, information to do things differently. And we need to share learning. So from a sort of undergraduate, postgraduate through to CPD level, sharing that information so that people will do things differently. So in the water sector, we've actually done some stuff in policy, influencing up to sort of UN level as to the importance of resilient water systems. A big sort of body of work that we've supported along with a number of other organisations is the city water resilience approach. And that's something where I'm now sort of the position that we're in the Resilient Shift, really keen to transfer what is possible from that work into other sectors. And I think some of the key things, maybe it's already played out to some extent in the water sector, because another thing that we supported was some work in Cape Town, learning the lessons from Cape Town's, they called it their day zero crisis, when a couple of years ago they were very close to running out of water and turning off the taps. The fragmented response is something that has been seen. So fragmented governance, and then when a crisis does hit, you don't necessarily get this joined up response. And in the water, sort of a city water context, it's maybe fairly self-explanatory that water doesn't follow particular sort of political or regional or governance boundaries. It responds within a catchment. So therefore the exercise has been to understand that catchment and all the stakeholders within the water sector. But I think as soon as we start thinking about transport and multimodal transport within a city, and the fact that users of transport don't really want to think about whether it's a road or a light rail or a heavy rail, they just need the transport connections. The same in an energy system. There, certainly in today's energy and the future energy, there's many different vectors for energy, and what's important to the end users is the supply of energy, or maybe the supply of electricity specifically. So I think there's a lot that is transferable. To pick up quickly on the lessons from Cape Town, which were absolutely fascinating. We supported the recording of some filmed, a large number of filmed interviews with different decision makers who had to respond to the day zero crisis and the lessons they learnt. And looking at those now in the context of the pandemic, we're seeing, so for example, there's a film module called The Importance of Communications, which says very clearly what the city leaders in Cape Town learned is as soon as they started telling everyone what was happening, where the water was, how the water levels were responding, everyone was like, oh, they described it as a collective sigh of relief. And if that lesson's not transferable today, I don't know what is. There was also something else around the role of business and how businesses were not sitting outside of the public sector. Everybody has a role to play in that. And again, I think we're seeing that maybe governments are not necessarily responding as and when they should, or there's a lot of confusion, but businesses are very much taking actions into their own hands. And I genuinely think, our systems are different, but the more we have this common understanding of what's needed for resilience before events, during events, and after events, the more likely we're actually able to have this systems approach where everything's sort of pulling towards and able to recover from events more quickly.
There's a lot in that. I remember Cape Town actually in water rationing, I think information in hotels saying use as little as possible, and there was sort of inequalities, I think, obviously that there are in South Africa in terms of how things are balanced, and I think we'll probably see that with the outcomes of COVID-19 as well.
Absolutely.
But some of the other aspects were interesting on supply of electricity as well and future energy. And it's a slightly a side question, but obviously there's a transition to electrification, and there's two components, I guess. The supply of electricity. Is that a risk factor for what capacity there is in the network? Is that something you've looked at? And also, secondly, the components, the mining of components, is that something you look at in this, or is that not so much on the focus?
It's super important. I wouldn't say that it's something that we've looked at, and I think that's another sort of important aspect of the work of Resilient Shift. This is a huge sort of global, cross-sectoral, transdisciplinary challenge. We know that no one sort of individual organisation is going to solve everything, and we're sort of try very actively to share good work by others and bring that into a platform that will actually sort of amplify the message. But in terms of your first point around availability of electricity, so something that we're thinking about right now is how to sort of shape and define a deep dive into supply of electricity or electricity security in the same way that we have done with water. And this is me sort of sharing fairly live thoughts, but I do think it's going to be very difficult to separate out the future transportation, the future energy supply, and the future communications and ICT systems, because they all become very, very highly interconnected and interdependent. And when we talk about things like vehicle to grid, the system, I think, gets bigger, and actually breaking down silos between systems, maybe those silos actually won't be there in the future. But I think the work we need to do now, or what I'm very keen for us to do now, is to sort of develop the tools, information, the way of looking at things to make sure the right decisions are made now as we sort of enter into this transition, and electricity, working very hard to get to net zero by 2050 or similar dates in many countries, transport working hard towards a decarbonised transport sector. Huge opportunities to make sure these decisions are joined up and that we do get a genuinely more integrated, more resilient infrastructure sector, but also huge opportunity, a sort of risk really of not doing that and missing that opportunity, focusing maybe more on the net zero, the decarbonised infrastructure, and not thinking about what's also needed for that future system to be resilient. So I think it's a great opportunity, but we need to move quickly. There's quite a lot of urgency as well.
And how can we be better prepared for the things that we can't control? So I feel like it's topical. That's a topical question as well.
It's very topical, and I guess I wouldn't want to sit here talking to you, Justin, as if I have the answers to that. That if only everybody had done what I was saying, we'd be fine. I think this is a very sort of real case of we can't control everything, we can't prepare for everything. We need to be agile, we need to be adaptable, we need to be flexible. I think there's so much that will be learned from the current crisis, and it's very difficult now because everybody's right in the middle of it. But one thing that's will be, I don't want to say fascinating because it makes me sound like a sort of neutral observer and we're all being affected by it, but there will be a new normal after this event. But in terms of preparing, I think to me there's a really important message that we've seen multiple times in sort of real scenarios, in simulated scenarios, and there's someone that we've worked with, an organisation that we've worked with called the EIS Council, and they run something called black sky hazard scenarios, and what that does is takes multiple organisations through a situation where there's not just a temporary power outage, but it's actually a regional power outage that doesn't recover, and it looks at the cascading failures. And the key lesson I think from that is any one organisation or government department or individual who thinks it's fine, I've prepared, I'm going to be okay. When you play through some of these scenarios, you just realise that you won't if you don't know what everybody else is going to do. So the need to share lessons, share learning, share planning, engage with other stakeholders, not run through a particular scenario just as an organisation. So, you know, me working at Arup, we can run through what we might do if the power goes out, but if we don't know what our neighbours will do, we won't get that insight. So as Resilience Shift, as I say, these black sky hazards are simulated events, but they're plausible. There's all sorts of reasons why a major power outage could happen, and it's not so much about the reason for it, it's about the consequences as that unfolds. Again, in Cape Town's day zero, the learnings that no individual organisation was on their own. So there's quite an interesting, and I think it's related to your audience in the transport sector, particular retail store in Cape Town maybe was just sort of watching what was happening in the water sector unfold and think this is about city government and supply of water. But then when they set the date at which they would turn the taps off, they had to actually think, well, if the taps are off and everybody has to queue at a standpipe to get water, how do my security guards get to work? Even if they're able to get to work because someone else is queuing for water, are the bus drivers able to get to work? Exactly as we're seeing in the UK, today, if the schools are closed, that has a massive impact across an entire supply chain. And it shares that exact same learning. So I think, the transport sector has to recognise how closely coupled it is with all other infrastructure sectors and with the community who both rely on the transport but operate the transport. And I think that's really important. So no silver bullet to preparing for this, but systems thinking, scenario planning, preparing for the big things as well as the more regular events. There are things that can be done.
Yeah, certainly. I listened to something yesterday, and it was scenario planning in hospitals for what over the coming weeks will be incredibly challenging to deal with. And I think that helped prepare, because I think there was one of the scenarios they ran through actually happened to one of the consultants. It was someone who had the coronavirus, and they needed a cesarean section, and there was a risk to infection, but they because they planned through that scenario, they knew what to do. They'd thought about it, they'd rehearsed it, and then they could deal with it. And I guess that scenario planning becomes more important than ever in terms of being able to say, okay, well, what are the what ifs in this? And you might not cover all of them, but you'll feel more confident at least if you've covered a number of them. But you did say, obviously, there is a transport focus, so just bringing it back to that a little bit about some of the work that might apply to the highways and transportation sector. What aspects of the Resilience Shift work would apply there?
So I think, as I said, we started with a focus on water, And we're now thinking about how we sort of do an equivalent deep dive on energy, and then we want to move rapidly into transport as well. And then for me, our work gets really interesting because it's the kind of the depth within one sector, but also the breadth. And we can start to achieve, one of our visions is this common understanding of resilience across sectors. But it's not true to say that we've only done water. So we have looked at a number of areas such as public policy for resilience that would cover the transportation sector as well. And we've also done some activities. One of the things we did last year was produced the sort of first part of a suite of what we call resilience primers. So these are documents that are developed very much on consultation with practitioners in the industry. So a series of key informant interviews delivered by different grantees who've got sort of specialize in these particular areas. And we've developed a primer for roads, which again, there's a sort of geographical context as well. And our view from that is while we're a global initiative and we're trying to develop wherever possible cross-sectoral knowledge and best practice, for people to be able to do something differently, this was a request very early on in the Resilience Shift work. It's all very interesting, but what do I do differently on a Monday morning? And actually, when you're trying to do that, you have to provide something that's more tangible and relevant. So we engaged, we worked with TRL, and they did a series of interviews with road operators, government departments, local authorities, sort of across the UK and Europe, and produced a primer. And we did that for road and rail. And again, while there's many commonalities with road and rail, we felt just highlighting the differences again would make this more usable for practitioners within sort of road organisations. We've also looked closely at ports, which again are highly interconnected with the roads and with decisions that are made in roads. Very interesting, certainly in the UK and some of the other countries that we've worked in, that roads are generally public sector, ports are typically private sector, and there's a degree of fragmentation between those two. So something that was very interesting when we started looking at ports was the impact of Brexit. So that's, we want to make clear in Resilience Shift that when people talk about resilience, what comes to mind is resilience to climate change, particularly. But we do believe that wherever possible, to take an all-hazard approach to resilience and to make the decisions that will help no matter what happens is more powerful. And that things that are happening at the moment are very much reinforcing that message, because remember when our concerns were only about Brexit, and now we've got concerns about, the transport system in pandemic, climate change is still here. So there's multiple things happening. So yeah, I think the road primer and the rail primer are things that we've done already. And as I said already, when we move into the energy space, I very much believe that there will be a lot of touch points into the transportation sector as part of that work.
As it's a global study,
yeah,
we're obviously aware of some of the challenges in climatic terms that the UK is facing, drier summers, but obviously more intense periods of downfall, so managing deluges of water. But across different countries and different continents, what are the kind of resilience challenges from a climatic aspect, and how's the Resilience Shift programme looking to address that?
I think the one thing I was going to pick up on that is absolutely. So the Resilience Shift being a global initiative, we have to recognise that there are all sorts of different challenges from climate change and more widely. Something that I've been connected to where we sort of see this very clearly is the PIARC, the World Roads Association technical committees, and I'm part of the technical committee for resilience and climate change. And on that committee, we have 51 members from around the world with, sort of diverse climatic conditions from northern Canada to Africa. And that provides a fascinating insight on really what's needed. And it comes back to something I was talking about earlier with the the all hazards approach. There are sort of interventions and changes that we can make to transport systems that will help no matter what, and thinking about how we respond, how we recover, how we maybe think about not an individual asset, but much more about how the system continues to function. And that should, ideally be a multimodal system, not purely a road system. However, it is still essential to be able to design our assets for the climate in which they're going to operate. And there are many different challenges that we do need to understand. And I think this is still very much emerging from the effects of sort of thawing permafrost in the northern areas to much longer periods of extreme heat. In the UK, so my background before I got heavily involved in sort of cross-sector resilience is I'm a geotechnical engineer. So something that continues to fascinate me is how our earthworks that were designed for one set of climatic conditions are going to perform in what we think will be much more cyclical, much more extreme events, but also more frequent wetting and drying. So there's a lot of emerging sort of research and science around what that will mean for the physical assets.
And it's maybe a sort of concluding thought, but about personal resilience. I think it's an important component. Has that been something that's been part of Resilience Shift, about how as individuals we have our own resilience to setbacks and shocks and unexpected events and so on?
It very much is. Our focus is on infrastructure systems rather than purely how we respond as individuals. But there's a phrase, I haven't found the right non-sort of jargon phrase for this, but we talk about socio-ecological technical systems. So absolutely, if we're thinking only about a physical technical system, whether that's rail or road or power supply or anything else, that's not what the system is. The system depends on humans and humans depend on the system. And if we only need our systems to be resilient because communities rely on them. I think one of the big global drivers that our infrastructure systems are sort of working within now is urbanization, and how many more people are moving into cities, which I think makes communities very dependent on the infrastructure to function. But the sort of other side of that picture is that we need the communities to be resilient as well. So there's no point only having these. It's sort of essential that the technical systems continue to function, but it's essential to recognize communities, society, as sort of a fundamental part of those systems. So there is a lot of work on what it needs for individuals to be resilient. But from our point of view, if we're looking at infrastructure and more broadly at the built environment, I think we can provide the systems that help and support. There's a much sort of greater move at the moment towards nature-based solutions and planting and green infrastructure, and genuinely that has the ability to enhance resilience through mitigating flood, for example. It has the ability, it reduces carbon sequestration achieved through more vegetation, but also providing a community benefit. So having green spaces, having access to much more nature, particularly within very sort of dense urbanized areas. I think we talk about the resilience dividend, which is you can make an intervention that will enhance resilience, but there's bigger benefits as well to community cohesion, to health and well-being, to air quality, and it's really then moving towards that whole system having the capacity to respond and recover as needed.
Cities and towns are often in a place where water flows too, so they're vulnerable to flooding.
Yeah.
What you can do in the uplands to manage flood risk?
I think it does come back to that system thinking and where's your boundary, and that's a perfect example of, if you're thinking of a city that is exposed to flooding, your boundary is not the outskirts of the city, your boundary is the catchment. And there are, I think, probably cost-effective, nature-based, low carbon, community focused solutions that can be done outside the city that have the effect of sort of mitigating flood risk within the city. So I personally, I think that's a fascinating area, and it comes back actually to what I was saying about the energy systems. If we only think about low carbon, we'll get to one place. If we only think about resilience, we'll get to one place. But we need to work really hard to think about both of those to get to the right place. And actually that gives a stronger business case. It gives more dividends. There's all sorts of reasons for doing that.
The last point on green infrastructure and it being used as a mechanism for both addressing the climate crisis and also for providing community well-being is actually a good plug for a couple of earlier podcasts that we've done. So if anyone's interested in those topics in a bit more detail, we've got a couple to listen to. That was fascinating. We covered a lot of topics, and thank you for your time, and good that we can connect virtually through the digital systems that we have, which shows that we are becoming more resilient, I guess. Thank you very much.